Hello, hello, hello. I'm Jack from Super Ad MMA Show. Today we're going to talk about the top 10 wars in MMA.
Jack and Mel weigh in.
This video came about because we put a tweet out to our lovely Twitter followers, and at @snowdragon_ got back to us and said, talk about a few of your favourite fights, any promotion, any discipline, some of your favourite finishes, etc. So I said I was putting together a list, rewatched Bigfoot, Silva, and Mark Hunt go at it. They responded by listing off a bunch of good wars, and I thought to myself, do you know what? Let's just do top 10 MMA wars. It's a bit more specific. All of these fights that I'm about to talk about went to decision. I feel like, although, for instance, Lawler and McDonald went 4.5 rounds, I still like the idea of doing something a bit different, so all these fights are decisions. Please make sure to check out our podcast, which we'll link down below, and you can follow us on our social media there, so let's get into it. Number 10, Cub Swanson versus Doohoo Choi. This fight happened in December 2016 in UFC 206. Cub Swanson faced up-and-comer Doohoo Choi. This fight won a ton of Fight of the Year awards. It was an absolutely mental fight. I remember watching this with my friend Jamie. He is what we would call a casual MMA fan. He was going mental. I was going mental. The fight was mental. This was just a fantastic fight, back and forth, but I think Swanson had it everywhere, to be honest. Doohoo Choi was very hyped coming into this fight, and Swanson was on a 2-fight win streak from what I remember. I've always really liked Cub Swanson, and when you look at who's actually beaten him, it's Ricardo Lamas, Frankie Edgar, Max Holloway, Brian Ortega, Renato Moicano, Shane Burgos. You know, one thing they all have in common is they're pretty damn good, so you've got to be very, very good to beat Swanson. So this fight was a great litmus test for the young up-and-coming Doohoo Choi, who unfortunately now is on a 2-fight losing streak. Swanson got the nod in this one. It was a great fight, and hopefully we see Doohoo Choi turn things around. Number 9, Adesanya versus Gastelum. This fight happened in 2019 at UFC 236. When you say Adesanya now, people automatically, I think, especially on Twitter, go to him as some sort of, the greatest of all time at middleweight. Obviously, that's Anderson Silva, clearly. But at this time, the hype was sort of thereabouts, and I think a lot of people, myself included, actually favoured Gastelum. It was an absolutely crazy back-and-forth fight. This fight's actually the polar opposite of the fight that we just saw recently with Adesanya and Romero, which was interesting to say the least. Gastelum's a guy who probably could be fighting at welterweight, but has acknowledged his love of his mum's cooking, which I kind of respect. I like that he just lives his life and goes about it. Very, very small for the division, but I kind of like fighters not cutting weight. If you've listened to the podcast, you'll have heard me saying this before. I think that it does help their performance, and I like to see more of it. This was the coming out party for a lot of doubters, because myself included in this, you just couldn't really ignore Adesanya anymore. His wins up until that point had been impressive, but he hadn't faced anyone on the level of Gastelum. It was a back-and-forth affair with both fighters being rocked, but ultimately Adesanya won the war of attrition. The real winners from this fight were the fans, though. What a fight, and of course the famous line where Adesanya said, "I'm prepared to die in here," which is just an absolutely baller thing to say in a cage fight. So fair play to Adesanya. I look forward to seeing both of them fight again. Number 8, a fight that we just talked about in the intro there, Bigfoot Silva versus Mark Hunt. This fight happened at Fight Night 33 in December 2013. It was probably the best heavyweight fight ever. As a side note, if you haven't read Mark Hunt's book, you definitely should. There's some seriously dark shit in it, though, so be prepared for that. There's stuff about child abuse and crystal meth, his crazy life. It's an incredible story. Mark Hunt, one of my favorite fighters ever. This fight was ridiculous. After this fight, Silva failed a post-fight drug test for elevated testosterone, and his ratio was something ludicrous. He had been undergoing UFC-approved testosterone replacement therapy, but he was suspended for 9 months in the end, which was retroactive to the date of this fight. Due to Silva's positive test, Hunt was actually given the $100,000 from the fight night bonus. The bout remains a draw for Hunt, but Silva was overturned to a no contest. It's one of the craziest back and forth fights ever. Both guys gassed as hell towards the end of the fight, just throwing crazy shit. Mark Hunt landed one of the cleanest, hardest shots I think I've seen in a fight, and somehow Silva managed to, although get knocked down, survive. Crazy war. This has to be on the list for me. It's one of my favorite fights ever. Number 7, Bonnar versus Griffin. We knew it was going to have to be on here somewhere. These are in no particular order because, to be honest, I would find it very difficult to put these in an order. This happened at the Tough One finale in 2005. It's arguably one of the most important fights in UFC history. I'm sure most of you watching know the story of the fight. This happened after the Ultimate Fighter series, where the UFC basically paid to get that series on the air. They paid for the show. There was very little in it other than marketing, and it was a last-ditch hurrah from the UFC. People were literally phoning each other as the fight was happening and telling them, yo dog, you got to tune into this fight, it's cray. And it really was. This fight pretty much saved the UFC. Forrest Griffin was one of the guys when I first started really watching the sport. I'd sort of been a more casual fan up until that point. I loved Forrest Griffin, still do to this day. He's a great fighter. Real mixed career in the end, but just always fun. And he's also fought some of the other guys on this list, like Shogun Rua, which we'll get to shortly. But this fight pretty much saved the UFC, as I said. Crazy fight, absolute war. Number 6, Shogun Rua versus Dan Henderson. Dan Henderson and Shogun Rua probably spent the bulk of their prime fighting in Japan in Pride, so that was maybe a little bit before I was watching a lot. But Mel, the other half of the podcast, he is a huge Rua fan and has been watching MMA as a more serious fan a little bit longer than I have. He would be able to tell you this probably from memory. This fight, it's etched into his memory, I am certain of it. It was essentially a number 1 contenders fight for the light heavyweight division, and it turned out to be one of the best fights in UFC history. It was a mixed run after this fight for Shogun, and he never really went on to recapture the magic of his run in Pride, where he beat many of the biggest names in the sport. And to be honest, Dan Henderson's story was much the same. The image of Dan Henderson that will always stick in my mind is him leaping into Michael Bisping with a sort of a forearm club after one of the most brutal KOs that the sport's ever seen. But this fight was the pinnacle of MMA for a long time. It was a real back and forth fight. It was absolutely phenomenal, and it's just hard not to like both of these guys. The fight went to Dan Henderson in the end, but both guys came out, fought their hearts out, and you can never not dig that. Number 5, Jon Jones versus Alexander Gustafsson 1. This fight happened in 2013 at UFC 165. Speaking of Jon Jones, I actually just last week came into possession of a signed Matt Hamill picture, which, as we know, is going to be worth money because Matt Hamill, the only guy to beat Jon Jones. It's an interesting fight, this, because I think a lot of people still to this day debate the scoring of it. I, as a massive Gus fan, still found Jon Jones winning the fight. I think he got rounds 3, 4, and 5 from what I remember. I love Gus. This fight was just inducted into the Hall of Fame fight wing. I can't blame them. Jon Jones came back with the last 3 rounds, as I said. If there's one common theme in all of Jon Jones' fights, it's been having a reach advantage. But coming into this, Alexander Gustafsson, 6'5", that wasn't as much the case. He's nearly as long as Jones, a little bit taller. He was on a 6-fight win streak at the time as well. Super well-rounded guy. He even managed to get Jon Jones to the mat, which I think surprised a lot of people, including Jon Jones. But this is what separates Jon Jones from others. Whether you love him or you hate him, he finds a way to win every time so far. That is anyway, apart from the Matt Hamill one. So you got to respect Jon Jones. This was the definition of a champion fight. I absolutely love this fight. I can't blame them for putting it into the fight wing of the UFC Hall of Fame. And as I said, with Gustafsson, one of my favourite fighters ever. Love him. Number 4, Robbie Lawler versus Carlos Condit. This fight goes back to January 2016 at UFC 195. The image of the two of them draped over the side of the cage, exhausted after the fight, is one that sticks out for me. It was initially scheduled a few months earlier, I think, but when it finally happened, it was absolutely worth the wait, and it did not disappoint. Mr. Robert Glenn Lawler, a man who's not exactly known for his first round finishes. Instead, he normally opts for the long, slightly more dynamic, war-y style of fights. He absolutely brought it to Condit, and Condit returned the favour. Condit's early UFC run was great, and his losses came in the flavour of Johnny Big Rig Hendricks, GSP, but a few fights later, a TKO win over Alves got Condit another shot at the belt here. With this fight, Condit's just like the little engine that never could, but what a fighter. He's been on a bad streak of late, and rumours of his retirement seem to have been floating around forever. Ruthless Robbie Lawler did get the win, and his reputation of wars did continue. Dana White did say, however, that he'd scored this for Condit, so make of that what you will. Number 3, Yoel Romero versus Paulo Costa. This happened at UFC 241 in 2019. It was an absolute crazy fight, as you would expect it to be. Yoel Romero, one of the most interesting people in MMA to me. I'm fascinated by his career. Had he come to the UFC or to MMA earlier, you do wonder just how good he could have been. even though he's on a 3-fight losing skid, you could put an argument forward that he won all of those fights. You know, the second Whittaker fight, you could have argued he won. The Paulo Costa fight, this one, you could have argued he won. An Israel Adesanya fight, you potentially could have argued that he won. He is a freak of nature. This fight went exactly how you would have expected it to go. Paulo Costa, due a title shot by the looks of it, looks like that's going to happen in July, providing that this coronavirus goes away. But that's by the by. This fight was everything and more that you could have wanted it to be. I was tempted to put Weili Zhang versus Joanna Jędrzejczyk in place of this, but there's two reasons I didn't. One is recency bias. I didn't want it to just be in because it was only a couple of weeks ago, but at the same time, I suppose this was quite recent too, I suppose. But I just couldn't not have Yoel Romero on the list somewhere. You know, his wars with Whittaker were in consideration too, but I just think the Paulo Costa fun was a little bit crazier and unbelievable fight. Be interesting to see what happens with Romero. Let us know in the comments down below if you think he's going to go to light heavyweight, if you think there's anything left for him at middleweight. But a weird career. I'm tempted to do a video down the line on Romero because, you know, with the missed weights and the nearly winning a handful of fights he probably could have, his career could have looked very, very different to it does now. So yeah, great fight, absolute chaos, and it is just one of the best fights that happened last year. 3 rounds of pure, unadulterated violence. Number 2 is Diego Sanchez versus Gilbert Melendez. This fight, 2013 UFC 166. The end exchange was mental. Melendez was one of the best lightweight fighters in the world during his prime. Upon entering against Sanchez here, he boosted a 21-3 record, fresh off a split decision loss to Dan Henderson for the lightweight championship. Meanwhile, Sanchez was just off a win against Takanori Gomi in Japan in what was super controversial from what I remember. I remember all of the media scoring that for Gomi, but hey, a win's a win. Sanchez's chin in this fight was ridiculous. It's one of the most famous fights ever. Melendez did get enough to get the win, despite the third round being a strong one from Sanchez. I think Joe Rogan branded him the best third round fighter ever, from what I recall. But don't quote me on that just in case. As of right now, Melendez is on a 5-fight losing streak, but you can kind of understand how that's come to be because he's faced Pettis, Alvarez, Barboza, Stevens, and Arnold Allen, who looks like he's going to go on to do decent things in the 155 division. The competition level there is steep. What a fight, etched in the minds of probably most MMA fans. It still goes down as one of the best fights ever. Certainly the best fight at lightweight for me anyway. I think perhaps more modern and more casual fans might have a different opinion, but for me, I remember this and I absolutely love this fight, still do to this day, and rewatching it for this video was an absolute pleasure. Number 1, Frankie Edgar versus Gray Maynard 2. In no particular order, as I said, this was at UFC 125 in 2011. Crazy fight. The image of Frankie Edgar rolling back after the hooks he was eating, and then he ate a ton of shots after that. That's what always sticks out for me with this fight. Edgar showcased that famous durability. He was a pro fighter from 2005, and he didn't get finished once until Ortega knocked him out in 2018. That's seriously impressive stuff. That's a record that I can't even think of someone else who's gone that long. That's, apart from maybe Habib, that's crazy, crazy stuff. Edgar had a great run at 155, especially considering how small he was, relatively speaking. He said to have eaten breakfast on the way in mornings, which does kind of make sense, especially since he's now talking about going to 135. Maynard looked huge compared to him in all their fights, but, you know, this being the second fight of the trilogy that Edgar ultimately won, for Maynard, this fight ultimately impacted his durability as he went on to take 5 TKO or KO losses into the next 7 fights. Frankie Edgar is still competing at a super high level. This fight would definitely be stopped now, in my opinion. It ended up in a draw, surprisingly, so there you go. Odd way to end the video. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like, share, subscribe. The biggest thing that you can do is tag your friends in this on Facebook, share the video to Facebook, to Twitter, to Instagram, to MySpace, to Bebo, to whatever the hell format it is, carrier pigeon, smoke signal, whatever you're using to contact your friends, especially in the quarantine times. That would be awesome. If you're interested in supporting the channel with them cold hard dollars, you can go to patreon.com/SuperAdMMA. Please make sure to check out the podcast. We put a lot of work into it, and we're open to suggestions for videos and new content. So stay subscribed, stay in touch, peace and love.